But first, over 100 flood warnings are in place across the UK as many homes and communities continue to come to terms with flooding caused by storms Ciara and Dennis. Well, we're joined now from central London by the Environment Secretary George Eustice. Thank you very much for being on the show this morning, Mr. Eustice. Hundreds of families are dealing with the devastation of floods. We've seen homes in places like Yorkshire's Calder Valley who've suffered from 6 floods in the last 5 years. What reassurances can you give these people on the show this morning that the government has got a grip on the situation?
Well, sadly, with climate change, these kinds of extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. We know if you look at the long-run trends that weather events like this are increasing in their frequency each year. And all we can really do is try to improve our flood defences and improve our response. So over the last 5 years, we've spent over £2.5 billion on over 600 flood projects. That's provided protection to over 200,000 homes, and there's more to come. And while it's been a terrible flood event these last 2 weeks, the ground has been waterlogged. We've had 2 consecutive storms and some 2,000 plus homes flooded as a result. We have also, during that period, protected some 50,000 homes with the measures we've taken in the last 5 years. And looking forward, we want to do even more. So we're committed to spending over £4 billion on additional flood defences in the next 5 years.
So I can't help thinking that the government talks a good game when it comes to flood defences. But just to pick up on the £2.5 billion funding that you've been talking about that was introduced from 2015, up to 60% of that is going to be spent around London rather than in places like Yorkshire, which are suffering. And that is because flood defence spending, the formula for it, is dependent on property prices. So, of course, as a result, disproportionately benefits homes in the south east. How can that be fair?
Well, I don't really think that's right. We direct our flood defence spending to areas that are at greatest risk and where the money will protect the greatest number of homes. That does mean that some of the big projects tend to be in our urban areas, but it's important to note that around 25% of all our flood spending has gone to Yorkshire. That's in recognition of the fact that Yorkshire is at risk of flooding. And indeed, last weekend I visited York and I saw the Foss barrier, and there's been some significant investment in that in order to improve its capacity in the last 5 years. So I don't accept that we're not investing in other areas, but there's always more that we want to do, and that's why in the next 5 years we're going to be spending even more on flood defences, and crucially as well looking at nature-based solutions, so moving upstream to try to slow the flow of water down to our urban areas in the first place, using dams and trees and natural floodplains and the like.
So just to clarify, you're saying that it's incorrect to say that property prices help to determine the flood defence formula spending?
Well, my understanding is the formula that is applied by the Environment Agency is looking at the number of homes that can be protected from a given scheme. And that is why it is understandable that your hard defences in urban areas will tend to be in your larger centres of population, because an investment there will protect the greatest number of homes. But it's not universally the case. And Yorkshire has been a big recipient of flood defence spending. York alone, we've been spending around £70 million to provide protections in the city of York and indeed upstream.
You can see why, though, some people outside of London would feel that if this was happening in London, in some of these big cities, closer to the politicians in Westminster, more would be done. I mean, where is the Prime Minister this week?
Well, look, when I was appointed a week ago on Thursday, the Prime Minister, when he met me, the first thing he said is there are some storms coming up. Storm Dennis is coming this weekend. We know the impacts are going to be what action we would take. It was agreed that I would make a visit to look at our preparedness over that weekend. It's not true that the Prime Minister's not been engaged in this. From the very moment he appointed me, he's been engaged. We stood up our National Flood Response Centre, and there have been daily conference calls that I've led. And you know, in a cabinet government, it's not a one-man show. It's right that on certain operational things such as this, the Prime Minister will ask one of his cabinet members to lead. I can't see anything wrong with that.
I don't think anyone's disputing the fact that it would be a one-man show. But at the same time, Boris Johnson hasn't been seen in public for 9 days. When there were floods back in November, he visited the affected areas. He called an emergency committee for the government's Cobra committee. Why do you think it is that he would do those things during an election campaign and not now?
Well, what happened on that particular incident in the election is that because it was an election and there were no ministers, and we were in what's called a purdah period where there was less ministerial involvement in the department, there was seen to be something of a slow start in response to that particular incident. And that's why, because of the criticism, the Prime Minister in that instance did stand up Cobra, I think. That's not been necessary this time because we actually have, sadly, because of the regular occurrence of flood events, we have something called the National Flood Response Centre, hosted in the Cabinet, coordinates cross-government coordination and action on these things. That's been stood up over 10 days now and has been leading all of the response to this. So you didn't need to stand up a separate Cabinet Office infrastructure in the form of Cobra because you already had one dedicated to floods that was operating.
You began the interview talking about how extreme weather is going to become more of a frequent event. Can a government really do anything to stop people's homes being flooded? Or is this just an inevitability of the world we're in?
Well, it's, I think, inevitable that we're going to get more of these extreme weather events. Of course, we have to do our bit to try to tackle climate change, and as a country, we are. We've led...
It's flooding inevitable.
Sorry, we've led the world. Well, flooding, it's the frequency of it, these weather events, of course, is inevitable because we've already got climate change. It's important that we do our bit to mitigate that by leading the world, as we are, in terms of reducing our carbon emissions and decarbonising our economy. And we're one of the first OECD economies to actually commit to net zero by 2050. But when it comes to flooding, there is more we want to do. And that is why we've committed to spend another £4 billion over the next 5 years, particularly looking at some of those nature-based solutions where we can slow down the flow of water, hold water upstream, use soft dams, have natural floodplains so that the water is less likely to get to our urban centres in the first place. But we'll never be able to protect every single home. It's important that we recognise that, but what we can do is do more and more to protect as many homes as possible.
OK. Now, the UK is going to this week publish its negotiating mandate with the EU for those upcoming trade talks. The negotiating mandate with the US we're expecting the week after. Now, your predecessor in the job, Theresa Villiers, said last month that we will not be importing chlorinated chicken, we will not be importing hormone-treated beef. Will you make the same commitment?
Well, look, the truth is that it's already illegal in this country to sell chlorine-washed chicken or indeed hormone beef. That's in our legislation. But the important thing I would say is we believe very passionately in this country about our food standards and our animal welfare standards. We've worked very hard over the last 20 years to build quite a sophisticated market where there's a lot of consumer confidence in the provenance of our food and how it was produced and the safety of our food. And we're absolutely clear as a government that we will not take risks either with our food standards, and that when it comes to animal welfare, we will be projecting our views on animal welfare on the international stage. It's the UK that's been a world leader in animal welfare, particularly farmed animal welfare, and we want to bring the rest of the world along with us.
So you said in that answer that it's currently illegal to have chlorinated chicken or hormone-treated beef, but of course, I mean, you've got a big majority. You could change that if you wanted to. So can you give a commitment that even if the US demanded it in a trade deal, it's a red line that we wouldn't cross?
Well, I'm not quite sure why the US would make such demands, because actually chlorine washes on chicken are a very outdated technology and it's not really used by the US anymore anyway. What they tend to use these days are lactic acid washes, and we indeed, even in this country, will use... Well, what I'm saying is we won't make any moves on our standards. We've got a clear position in this country that it is illegal to sell chlorine-washed chicken, illegal to sell beef treated with hormones, with no plans to change those things. But equally, as I would say, it's not the case that the US currently use chlorine-washed chicken anyway.
OK, now moving on to immigration, because we've got a bit more guidance on what the post-Brexit immigration policy will look like for this government. And it's all about kind of restricting what the government determines to be kind of low-skilled workers. Of course, one of the sectors that relies heavily on workers from abroad is agriculture. If you restrict the number of workers that comes from abroad, is that not going to hit farmers and basically force people into buying more food from overseas?
Well, the government recognises that agriculture is a special case, and that's why what we've also announced in the past week is that we're going to quadruple the size of the seasonal agricultural workers scheme to 10,000 initially this year. It's very important that certain sectors such as soft fruit, vegetables and salad production, they're quite reliant on seasonal labour. That's people who come here to work maybe for 6 months before returning home. And we recognise that's entirely different to people migrating to the UK to settle permanently. That's why a seasonal agricultural workers scheme is important and will be an important part of our immigration policy in the future.
So you mentioned there that you're quadrupling the number, but that only takes the total to 10,000. I mean, the National Farmers Union says we need 70,000 workers every year. It's nowhere near enough, is it?
Well, this was 2,500 last year. This is the second year of a pilot, and we've increased it to 10,000. And of course, after the completion of that pilot, it's not this year, no, but they don't need 70,000 this year because we still have free movement for the remainder of 2020, and they will be able to recruit the other staff that they need from countries such as Romania and in particular Bulgaria, as they have done in previous years. The important thing will be in the future, and obviously the pilot will end this year, and we'll be in a position to roll out a fully fledged seasonal agricultural workers scheme that can be designed to provide the needs of the agricultural and horticultural sector.
You see, the government says it wants to bring down low-skilled immigration. Many people would see perhaps a more accurate description of that as low-paid jobs rather than low-skilled jobs. Why is it that high-skilled jobs or highly paid jobs should go to people from overseas, whereas the low-paid ones are reserved for Brits?
Well, I think the important thing to recognise here is we want as a country to strike a different course on our immigration policy, rather than having what we've had in recent years, which is effectively complete free movement with EU countries and then quite a restricted regime for the rest of the world. It's important that we are consistent and that we have an approach based on skills, and that we enable people to come here from wherever they might live if they have the right skills to contribute to our economy. So identifying those areas where we have a skills shortage, whether it might be vets, whether it might be NHS staff, whether it might even be chefs or people who do specialist welding, identifying those types of skills where we have a gap and allowing people to come to work in those sectors is a logical approach, rather than having free movement and a complete free-for-all with the European Union.
I mean, the Home Secretary said that the kind of lower skilled jobs shortages could be filled by the 8.5 million people classed as economically inactive. But according to the Office of National Statistics, most of those people who are economically inactive are students, carers, they've got long-term illnesses, or they're retired.
Yes, I don't think the Home Secretary was saying that all 8 million of those people would be able to fill these, just that there are people there who might. And I think that's right. There will be some people who've perhaps retired but would like to still take a part-time job. There are students, of course, who take a part-time job as well. So she's not saying that all of those 8 million people can work. She was saying that there are a pool there of people who could do some. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate point to make. But a more important point is, obviously, we're going to keep an eye on all of these things. At the moment, there are over 3.2 million EU citizens who've already applied for settled status here in the UK, so they will be staying. So those who are already working here and living here can stay. And as we look forward, we can then judge what our needs are. At the moment, we don't think there's a need to open a route for so-called low-skilled occupations, but we'll be keeping a very close eye on this and see how things develop over the next couple of years. And the beauty of being outside of the European Union is you have that flexibility as a country to set your immigration policy and to modify it as and when required to ensure that it's fit for purpose.
And then just finally, you've been in the Department for the Environment before, of course, but you've only recently been appointed Environment Secretary. So I'm just quite interested to hear your views on fox hunting.
Sorry, did you say that again?
I'm interested to know your views on fox hunting.
Fox hunting. Well, look, as a government, we're not going to change the fox hunting, the ban on hunting with dogs. It's been in place now quite a long time. There's been arguments about it in a number of general elections. It's always been a free vote issue, and there was a point in history when the Conservatives said that they would offer a free vote on hunting in government time. That's no longer the position. We think there's a new settlement now on fox hunting, that the ban on hunting with dogs should stay in place.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Thank you.